Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Anne Marrow. This is Anne's Book Club, a spotlight episode of the Long Thread podcast, where we share conversations about some exciting new craft titles. This episode features 3 new books from Storey Publishing: The Stitched Landscape by Anna Hultin, The Handsewn Wardrobe by Louisa Owen Sonstroem, and Knitting Cowlettes by Safiyyah Talley. You'll hear a conversation with each of the authors, followed by an excerpt of some of my favorite passages. I was excited to choose each of the titles to feature, and I hope you'll enjoy the conversations and books as much as I have. Anna Hultin is the artist and educator behind Olander Co. Embroidery. She uses needle and thread to create contemporary embroideries that explore the often overlooked beauty of the subtle textures and colors of the Colorado landscape. Her book, The Stitched Landscape, an embroidery field guide to the textures, colors, and lines of the natural world, comes out from Storey Publishing in October 2025. Anna lives with her family in Loveland, Colorado. So Anna Hultin, it's great to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too, Anne.
So I'm looking at your beautiful book, The Stitched Landscape, which is so inspiring. Can you tell me a little bit about this project and your work and this book?
Yeah. Well, gosh, I would say that I've always wanted to write a book. I always knew that that was something I wanted to do. And yet there are so many embroidery books out there, and I really didn't want to write a book of just patterns. I wanted this book to be something really special and about sort of my walk with art as a whole, and also just to give readers the ability to sort of find their own style and their own perspective on the landscape without just giving them a bunch of patterns. So kind of helping people develop their eyes and develop their compositions and develop their own style. And so that was sort of my goal with it.
Now, for those of us who feel more comfortable with patterns, what you're saying there sounds like it might be a little bit above my level. You know, my last level of art class was, participation trophy and can't draw a straight line. So, the idea of doing my own composition, that's something that I feel like maybe can I do that? Am I capable of that?
Oh my gosh. Yes, you are. So I break it down so it's so simple. And so I give you all the tools and all the building blocks to be able to do that. And we start super simply. And there are 11 patterns in the book. So we really do walk you, like I try to hold your hand, go step by step. And we start out super simply. And then we have more advanced projects. So you can start at any level that you want to. And then I give you a lot of tools to kind of create your own landscape. So I should have said that. It really is. We kind of do start with the pattern and start with like, I'm giving you everything. And then I want you to start thinking, ooh, I want to add these flowers instead of these ones and these grasses instead. Or what if I change the color and sort of learn by doing? And so to do that, I think it is best to start with a pattern, especially if you don't have that experience. So there's plenty of that as well.
And when I look out at my landscape, you and I are both in Colorado, and sometimes that landscape is really inspiring. But, if I look out, I'm pretty much seeing flat to Kansas. So, when you are looking at a landscape, how do you find things that are kind of worth putting needle to fabric?
Well, thank you for asking this question, because this is something I think a lot about. So I'm going to kind of start a little bit back earlier in my life. I moved here from upstate New York, and in upstate New York, it is just trees everywhere, and the landscape is lush and green, and it's beautiful, right? And when I moved here, I hated it. I actually really, really hated it because of what you're saying. There was just this horizon line, and you could see just for miles and miles and miles, and it was all brown, except for maybe like 2 months out of the year when it's spring and everything's green, and then it dries because it's hot. And so I hated it. But over time, I just kept looking and I kept looking and I kept looking. And somehow now, fast forward, 20 years later, I think it is the most beautiful landscape in the world. And so I did that by looking closely and by stopping and watching and just noticing. and by having my imagination sort of go into the landscape. So like, for example, we have these cottonwood trees in Colorado, and they never grow quite straight. And I think it's because of the wind. The wind kind of morphs them. So that to me, they always look like sort of people dancing and like bending at really strange angles. And so I started imagining these giant trees as like humans dancing. And I did that. I remember, I think it was in like fourth grade. I moved here in third grade. And so I started sort of imagining things in the landscape, and it started to come alive to me. And so I sort of my biggest goal as an artist is to help people stop, look closely, and start seeing beauty in places that they might have overlooked and might have actually even hated. And obviously that's kind of a metaphor for life, right? Like we want to ignore all the mess and all the grief and all the hard things, but when we take the time to embrace it, they actually become quite beautiful. And so that's why it's so important to me, is because it's much more than just a landscape. It's embracing those things that we actually thought were kind of ugly. And so that's why most of my work is brown grasses and things like that, which a lot of people are not that interested in, and that's fine. I'm doing it for myself to find the beauty there. So that is a huge thing to me, to find beauty in unsuspecting places, like a piece of dead grass, and finding a poetic nature to it. Like a piece of dead grass actually has a seed head that holds the entire field for the next year's spring. And so it's like seeing those things adds that level of meaning to my life and to my work.
And it also seems like you're kind of inviting people to have a sort of a deep spiritual grounded, that makes it sound very woo-woo, but I think that there's something about that where people want to have a real authentic experience. There's a reason why grounding, we talk about being grounded, and you're inviting people to be grounded through their embroidery.
Exactly. Because that's what it did in my own life. It was when I first started embroidering, I had just had a baby, and I felt very ungrounded. It's having a baby, it changes your whole life. And I just started by creating these studies of trees and plants, and I would just look at photos of them, and I would look really closely. And it was so meditative. It just kind of like calmed my mind in a way that nothing else could. Mm. That's why also embroidery, exactly what you're saying about grounding in the landscape, and also why embroidery is like the perfect meditative medium to sort of explore a landscape.
Mm. And certainly people find something, meditative in stitching. A lot of us are turning to crafts that we make with our hands for, sort of a more present experience.
Yes. Yeah. We live in a digital world. It's so ungrounded, and it's so easy to live in a reality that's not in our actual tangible lives. And thread and needle is so tangible. Mm-hmm. And even when it's finished, you can feel it with your hands. And it is the opposite of that sort of digital realm in my mind.
So one of the things I've really enjoyed about your book is, you talk about wanting people to look more deeply, and, that's not just a sort of aspiration. You give concrete exercises and tips and ways to help people look more deeply at what's around them. How do your eyes move through the landscape?
Well, that's a good question. So often I feel like the biggest time I'm observing the landscape, it sounds silly, but it's when I am a passenger in a car and I'm just looking out and looking at the landscape, and I'm like, oh my gosh, look at those grasses over there, or look at those flowers, and then look at that color. And so I often sort of take it in as a whole, but I'm always sort of looking for movements and patterns. And I think it just developed over time. Like I said, maybe in a search to like start finding beauty where I thought there was no beauty. And now I see beauty everywhere. So I think it just sort of developed sort of throughout my whole life. And now as an artist, now I have an actual use for all those things I'm seeing. I take what I'm seeing and I directly translate that to needle and thread. And so now it's almost more of an obsession. Like I can't be in a landscape without seeing it. But I think it just kind of developed gradually over time as an effort to try to find something beautiful in a place I did not see any beauty.
I think it's hard sometimes for people who are accomplished artists to go back to, I don't know how to look at something. So sort of giving people tips for how to approach something and when to go back, you must be sort of putting yourself in the mind of somebody who is sitting there and thinking, I don't really know what to do here.
Yeah, well, to be specific, my husband is the one. So he, he's usually the one driving, and I'm usually the one finding all this stuff in the landscape. And he said recently, over the past 5 or so years, I mean, we've been married for longer than that, but like over the past, he's noticed 5 years or so, he's noticed that he now sees the landscape like I do. And so when I started writing the book, he was the one who said, you need to teach people how you see the land. That has to be the starting point. Because now, he said, now I see it everywhere too, but I didn't see it before. And so it's really helped to have him and have kids. I have 3 kids, and teaching them how to see the landscape and observe closely. Yeah, it has helped me really think through. So what things were helpful in learning how to see the landscape? Where do you start? How do you go from seeing no inspiration anywhere to finding it everywhere, and just taking it really step by step and having really clear, concrete ways to do that was really important for the book and something I really tried to do.
One of the things that you see is a real depth and range of texture. And when you're working on a single kind of fabric are you mostly using kind of, pearl cotton embroidery floss? So
yes,
creating
mostly.
Multiple textures out of 2 fairly simple, smooth materials, how do you go about that?
Well, so I did say, yes, I mostly use the embroidery floss, but for the texture piece, I do use wool roving or roving wool. I never know which order to say that in, but I use the wool, and that really helps add a whole new depth of texture, but also just through different stitches. So like the French knot has a texture all unto itself. And so when I first started embroidering, I would do whole huge sections of just French knot to like get a certain texture. So you really, because the thread itself is 3-dimensional and has that quality to it, you really can build up more texture than you think. So I would say by exploring different stitches, by using wool roving, and also just by layering. Like when I first started embroidering, I thought that all the stitches had to be lined up and they shouldn't be overlapping. And now I overlap them all the time. And so that just kind of builds up texture naturally by layering like that too.
Which I suppose is kind of how the landscape does it.
Yes, exactly. Because if you look at a blade of grass, it doesn't have much texture, but when you see a field of it, it's all there. So I see thread as line, and I see a lot of line in the landscape as well to build that texture. So one thing to mention too is my degree is actually in drawing. So I very much approach needle and thread as pencil and paper. And so, and with pencil and paper, it's just a pencil and paper, but you can create all sorts of texture with it. So I very much approach it in the same way.
So you have actually, taught folks your style of embroidery before. What do people tend to find most surprising or most challenging or most rewarding?
Well, I think that the most surprising thing from what I've heard from students is just that it was easier than they thought it was to build a landscape. When you take it step by step and you kind of see the different components that you're working with, like the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, and you see them as these concrete things that you're just kind of piecing together, it became a lot easier for people than they realized. And that was, for me, that was a really rewarding thing to see people kind of fall in love with it that way. And I think the challenging thing is just the amount of time it takes, because embroidery is very slow. I'm really fast at it now because I do it every day, and I've done it every day for like 10 years. But when you first start, it is slow and it is arduous. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge. And just finding that regular time to create space to sit down and do that is challenging. It's just challenging in our everyday lives. So those are kind of the biggest challenges I see for people.
Well, I have to say that one of the reasons I was really excited about your book was that, as I said, I'm somebody who never had the idea that I could be artistic or even, keep a notebook or a sketchbook or anything like that. So, the fact that this book gives me not only sort of visual inspiration, but concrete steps toward I don't even want it. It makes me nervous to even say being an artist, but that's sort of,
say it.
It makes me feel like maybe I could make a little art.
You can. No, you really can. I mean, well, if it makes you feel better, I didn't start calling myself an artist until fairly recently. I don't know why, but it is a hard identity to like call yourself, because people have an idea of what an artist should be, that comes along with it. And so it can be very daunting to say, I'm going to make something that's art, and call it that, because I think it takes a certain amount of courage to do that. But I also really, really, really think that everyone can do this. And it is really just a matter of whether or not you want to, and whether or not you find a passion in it. Like for me, when I am embroidering or drawing or doing something artistic, the world around me stills, and it is unlike anything else in my life, and something that I need to do. And it's been that way for my whole life. And if I didn't have that, I wouldn't have spent the amount of time creating these things, and I wouldn't have the technical skills. But I started with zero technical skills. And so it's like you always start at zero, and it's just a matter of how much time you want to invest in it. And I really think that anyone can do it. And part of my other kind of passion is teaching, and I have a teaching degree, and I write art education curriculum and stuff like that. And so I really do deeply believe that, and I think you can do it. And I want to see what art you make, Anne.
So that explains your education background. That explains why the directions in the book, not only the step-by-step directions, but the learning a skill directions, are so carefully planned out and seem really easy to follow.
Yes. I have a lot of experience in teaching and watching people, like what steps do they need to make them feel comfortable doing this. And it's really those step-by-step concrete instructions that make a difference. I will never forget my art education professor, he said, he would always talk about how if you walk into a first grade classroom and you say, who here can draw or paint, they will all raise their hands. And then if you walk into a seventh grade classroom and you say, who here can draw, maybe one or two kids will raise their hands. So at some point between that first grade and that seventh grade, we get this idea that we can't do it anymore. And that is what I'm trying to kind of recover for people, is like, just have fun, play with the materials, experiment, find joy in it, and then you actually can do it. I want to recover that for people and help them find joy in creating again. So that's my passion.
Anna, thank you so much for telling me a little bit about your book, The Stitched Landscape.
You are so welcome. It was so fun to chat with you and talk about this.
I'm just going to share a few of my favorite passages from the book. How to use this book. This isn't your typical embroidery book. Although it has plenty of embroidery patterns for you to follow, more than anything, this book offers in-depth practice of the artistic process, from the spark of inspiration to a final piece and everything in between. I hope you will learn as much about observing the land as you do about embroidery. Whether you are picking up a needle and thread for the first time, or have experience as a fiber artist, and wherever you are in the seasons of your life, my aim is to inspire you to grow in your creative practice. These projects are meant to build your skills and offer opportunities for discovery as you develop your own style and point of view. I'm excited to see how you'll take what you learn in these pages and apply it to your own observations of the world around you. In both form and function, thread is the perfect material for exploring landscape art and nurturing a connection to nature. Thread can be line, it can be texture, it can stay in a hoop or spill out of it. You can layer stitch after stitch, which is perfect for building up layers of grasses. Conceptually speaking, thread connects fabric, and connects us to our ancestors who were embroidering centuries before us. What better medium could there be to link us to the land? And there's a passage that I just love, called I hate it. I'm often working on a piece and get to a point where I think, this just isn't working. Here's a secret. This is an exciting and pivotal moment in your work. Every one of my most successful pieces has had a moment like this. My least successful pieces usually don't. This is an opportunity to reconsider everything you originally thought was going to work. You look for other options, and usually the expansion of your thinking brings the work to the next level. Embrace the difficulty of the moment, and don't be discouraged if it happens more than once in a single embroidery project. Louisa Owen Sonstroem studied design and pattern making at Fashion Institute of Technology. She works in technical design and pattern making and teaches hand sewing and pattern making classes. She also started Pattern Making in Public Places, an outreach project to democratize access to pattern making skills. Her book, The Handsewn Wardrobe, a complete guide to making your own clothes from pattern making to finishing stitches, is out now from Storey Publishing. Louisa lives in Connecticut with her family in a house filled with board books, dog beds, and lots of fabric. So, Louisa, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So you've written about the hand-sewn wardrobe. I have to say that, I might think about sewing a skirt, but a hand-sewn wardrobe just sounds like such an ambitious undertaking.
And it is. I will say that, of course, you don't need to sew every last thing in your wardrobe by hand. The idea of the book is that it shares all sorts of categories of clothing that you could stitch by hand. And although it is a project-based book, I really intended it to be more of a manifesto almost, and sort of like proof to people who come across this book that, oh yes, you really could hand stitch whatever it is that you're thinking of by hand. And you don't need to hand stitch everything, and you don't need to hand stitch anything, of course, but now you know it's possible.
And a large part of the book is not only about the, in and out thread following needle, but it's about the way that you can tweak something to fit yourself when you're not having to do it, just put down the presser foot and go. So can you tell me a little bit about how you approach fit and custom tailoring?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is really two books in one. So on its face, it's a hand sewing book, but it is also very much a pattern making book. And I feel very passionate about pattern making as kind of a magical skill set that a lot of people, I think, feel it's sort of intimidating, like it seems intimidating. And a lot of the resources out there to learn about it can feel intimidating. So I am always on a campaign to encourage people to make themselves at home in that realm of drafting patterns for their own bodies and their own styles, preferences, visions. You can make pattern making as simple or as complicated as you want, but the beauty of it is that you are not retrofitting somebody else's idea of a body to try to match what your body is. You just take measurements from your own body that can just be really neutral pieces of information, and then you plot them out onto paper and you connect the dots. It's very satisfying. The whole process is guided by your body, your goals, your creativity. And then at the end of it, you come up with a pattern that will still need to be like fit tested on your body. It's always just an educated guess, that first pattern draft. It's called pattern drafting for a reason. It's a draft, but it will be a much better starting point for fitting in general than somebody else's pattern. Of course, other people's patterns are wonderful and we should use those too whenever we feel like it. But I just want people to know that they have that ability within themselves. So that's a long way of saying that for each project, each chapter in this book, the first section is on how to draft that pattern for your own body. And then the second half of the chapter is spent talking through the hand sewing techniques to construct the thing.
I think that, like a lot of the, crafts of our long thread media folks, weaving and spinning and to some extent knitting, there's this idea that people used to do it, but, it's not accessible to us anymore. So, but even like a generation ago, people will talk about how, oh, my mother she made all of our clothes, or she would just sit down and, knew how to fit things to herself. Do you think that that's just a matter of practice, or is there something that people were taught? I mean, we don't have home ec anymore.
I think all of that and more. Yeah, we don't have home ec anymore. A lot of us, our parents maybe didn't have those skills, or had some, but not the comprehensive set that maybe 100 years ago they might have had, or 150 years ago, or whatever. Also, so I work in the garment industry. I work in technical design and I do some pattern making in combination with that. And so I've been able to see up close that pattern making, along with garment production itself in factories, has really moved out of the United States. So the company that I work for now, we do happen to have one in-house pattern maker, and I've been able to work with him, which is wonderful. And he happens to be a very generous teacher, but that is actually quite unusual. Most pattern making for most companies is now done overseas. All that to say, even in fashion school, you learn pattern making, but when you get on the real job, it's very likely not going to be you making those patterns. And so just so much of that knowledge is literally retiring now or it's elsewhere. So I'm very passionate about pattern making, as I already said, and encouraging people to hold on to what they can learn and share it with each other and just keep going. We can still do it. You can still do it.
And I'm thinking particularly of weavers because, I weave cloth that would be difficult to make into something that required any drape. But for weavers who are interested in, making products with their own fabric, yeah, it might take a long time to hand sew something, but you spend a long time making this fabric. You might as well, first of all, enjoy the fabric a little bit longer. But secondly, it seems like one of the advantages of hand sewing is that you get to stop and make a lot more decisions and kind of tweak along the way. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. And I think that the long thread crowd is actually a really good fit for considering hand sewing because they already know about patience and celebrating the little moments of victory, this sort of smaller units of accomplishment before you reach the finish line. So absolutely. And I love the slowness of hand sewing. I will say I did not used to. I did not used to consider myself a patient person. I'm still not sure I consider myself a patient person, but I did while working in the fashion industry and while just kind of being a person in the world, I did start to become very uncomfortable with the amount of waste, just garments that didn't need to exist, garments that weren't very good, whatever, and that they just kind of pile up on our planet. And so I started noticing that not only was that happening in the fashion industry, but also in my own garment making practice at home, that I was just whipping things out really fast because I was so excited about the pattern making. So then I needed to test it out by machine. And then, it just kind of was this wonderfully exciting, but somewhat wasteful cycle of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, wait a second, maybe hand sewing would be a way that I could still sew a lot, as much as I wanted to, but more thoughtfully and create less, per month, just kind of less output, except that I could enjoy all of those little decisions and be, as you say, so much more thoughtful about them. And it's just so interesting when you get into those fine level decisions, whereas sewing by machine, it just flies by.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things when I first started sewing was a little scary was the idea of all the cutting, but you don't actually have to cut right away. You can baste, you can leave a nice seam allowance and decide if you want to tweak something. And so when I was looking at your book, one of the things that I was really inspired by is that it doesn't require yards and yards and yards of fabric to make, a first draft. So this sort of manifesto that you're proposing in this book, it seems like that's kind of catching up with a movement that people are having in the world toward more hand sewing. Are you finding that that's true? Either hand sewing or pattern making or just generally taking charge of their clothing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, of course, there's, the kind of slow fashion, quote unquote, movement and other kind of words for it. But there's so much energy toward thoughtful, slow creation of clothing these days. I will say when I first started trying to sew clothing by hand, maybe 2018 or so, and I don't know, something around there. And I remember it felt like nobody was doing it. I mean, certainly there were like people sewing historical garments in historically truthful ways by hand. And there's, haute couture clothing sewn by hand and Savile Row tailoring. There are these fine traditions of hand sewing. But in terms of like hand sew your own t-shirt, hand sew your jeans, hand sew your underwear, that was a difficult thing to find. And yet it was something that I felt like, wait a second, I think that this could be it feels important to my little world. And I think other people it might resonate with too. So I started sharing about it on Instagram, and I pitched a class for it to Tatter in Brooklyn, New York, where I was living at the time. And I remember feeling very shy and nervous as I pitched the class. Like, I know this is going to sound crazy, and I know it's probably not going to, make a whole lot of sense at first, but like, I think it could be really cool. And they just immediately went for it. Everybody just said, oh my goodness, yes, I get that. I think I need that. So it just kind of snowballed. Mm-hmm. And for that first class or first few times that I taught that initial class, I started making a class handout booklet kind of thing with stitches and other techniques. And it ended up being, I think, 80 pages long.
Wow.
And I said, oops, I think this is actually like the beginnings of a book. So, and people were very excited about that idea. So I did develop it into a self-published book that I released in beginning of 2021 called Handsewn Clothing, A Guide. And that book has I have not been able to keep up with people's enthusiasm for it, which is just so cool to be able to say. Mm-hmm. But like, because they're physical books that I was trying to make physically and sell, mail out physically, I just couldn't even keep up with it. So all that to say, oh yes, there is definitely excitement for this topic. People, for all sorts of reasons, are very ready for the idea of hand sewing clothing. For me, as I said, it was a way of slowing down. For other people, it's a way to kind of meditate and make especially beautiful clothing. There's sort of all these different ways to come to it. But I think most people, once they try it, get it.
Well, when I picture hand sewing clothing, I have to say that I initially pictured, willowy people with ideal figures making lightly shaped tank dresses. So something that wouldn't necessarily require a lot of shaping, that would look good on anyone. And one of the things in this book is that you're yes, there are things that'll be flattering on a wide variety of people, but you're also talking about ways to really lean into what people's individual bodies are like.
Yeah. And I mean, I do think that that's the pattern making component. When you are literally drawing your own shape onto paper, then it's going to look like your own body, more or less when you stitch it up. As for the aesthetic of hand sewing, it's actually really interesting what you said there, that like there are these kind of pictures that might come to you of what hand sewn clothing would be like and who would be doing it and all of that. And it can really look like anything, which is one thing that I feel pretty strongly about reminding people, that you may have seen hand-sewn clothing before in a certain context. Maybe it's historical. Maybe it's one of the beautiful Alabama Channon creations that are so, texturally rich and just gorgeous. Maybe it's whatever it is. But it could also look like whatever else it is that you're thinking of. I mean, you can make hand stitches to look like they're done by machine. Do you want to? That's its own question. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But the even back stitch looks from the top exactly like the machine lock stitch. So my jeans project in the book, I do show jeans that kind of play that game. You can hand sew bras, you can hand sew swimming suits, you can hand sew overalls for farm work. I mean, people used to hand stitch everything and do very hard manual labor before the Industrial Revolution. These can be very strong, sturdy stitches, and they can look like whatever you want them to.
So you mentioned Alabama Channon, and she is someone who's profiled in your book, but there's also a lot of other really interesting makers. There's Matthew Nagy, who we've talked to before, who does, traditional, really historic garments. Can you tell me about these other folks that you spoke with who are also hand sewing?
Yeah, I love that part of this book. Sprinkled between the chapters are these sort of mini interview snippets from 9 different people who are not me, but hand sew clothing today. I felt like it was very important to include those voices because I want the reader to know my way is just the way that I happen to do it right now, works for me. It has occurred to me. It will probably be different in 2 years. And also, every single person will do it differently because of their background, the ideas that they have, the resources, materials, tools that they have access to. It's going to look different for everybody. Some people use thimbles. I am a strong promoter of thimbles, but there's also people who don't, including in these interviews that I include. There's people who say, I just don't use a thimble and it works for me. And I think it's really liberating to hear all these different voices saying, like, this is what I do. These are the rules that I break. Who cares about the rules anyway? And, these are the things that have informed what I do. And here's where I'm going.
Well, Louisa, thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to digging into this book.
Thank you.
It's a radical, simple act to make your own clothes by hand. The tools are few, and most are relatively inexpensive. The techniques needn't be complicated either. With a handful of good stitches at your command, you'll be able to construct all manner of beautiful, sturdy garments. And if you approach your projects with a willingness to experiment, you'll never stop learning. Empowerment, accessibility, mental stimulation, endless opportunities for growth, and a set of amazing clothes. What's not to love? Let's get started. Here are a few of the many reasons hand sewing clothing is wonderful. It is slow, so it dials down your output and calms your mind. Far, far, far more portable than machine sewing. Much more productive than you might think, because you can work on it everywhere, anytime. Slow and steady really can win the race. Much less expensive than machine sewing. Amazingly strong and sturdy, as long as you use good thread and appropriate stitches. Deliberate and controlled, your speed will always match your attention, and the results will reflect your intention. Precise. Quiet, which means you can stitch beside a napping baby or late at night in an apartment with thin walls. Different from anything you can find in a store or in anyone else's closet. Simple in process, yet sophisticated in the result. Soft to touch, the seams are less stiff than machine-sewn ones. Personal. And yours, your hands will be directly responsible for the beautiful things you make, and that's an empowering feeling. Learning how to make patterns is one of the coolest, most transformative experiences. You can make anything. Pattern making may have a bit of a reputation as intimidating, difficult discipline, but it needn't be that way. There are so many more possibilities than limitations in this craft. And by the way, no one knows everything about pattern making. No one. So just relax and enjoy yourself. Make note of the principles shared in this book and elsewhere, but lean into the gray areas and creative opportunities too. You'll learn just as much by messing around with patterns as by following anyone else's instructions. The more you try, the more you'll learn. Safiyyah Talley is the author of Knit 2 Socks in 1 and creator of the popular blog The Drunk Knitter. She teaches knitting classes virtually and at knitting shows. Her second book, Knitting Cowlettes, Clever Techniques for Making Custom Mini Cowls to Elevate Any Outfit, is out from Storey Publishing. Safiyyah lives in Indiana. So Safiyyah, thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So I think of you as being such a creative and innovative knitter. I absolutely loved your book on sock knitting. And so I was really excited that you have a book about cowlettes coming up. Can you tell me a little bit about how you approach knitting and where you think you get that sort of creative, unusual spark?
Well, first, thank you so much. I'm so proud of my first book. And when I am writing my books, I'm always trying to solve a problem while trying to keep the knitting process as inclusive as possible. I don't want someone to look at my book and be, wow, I have to really practice to be able to pick up some of the techniques in this book. I want it to be accessible for beginners while still being useful for more advanced knitters. And so I think about all that while I'm writing the book, and it makes me think outside of the box a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I also always poll my current knitters to see what current issues are they having with their knitting. And then I try to brainstorm, how can I fix those issues?
So it's interesting that you talk about wanting your designs to be inclusive. And I think one of the cool things about cowlettes is that there are a lot of different techniques, but they're presented in a way that's not too alarming. It's not like, we're going to knit in the round, let's do a whole sweater.
Yeah, it's almost like a mini sweater in a way, because you begin flat and then you join in around, and there is quite a bit of stitch counts, but it's all presented in an easy to digest way. It's a great way to start learning a little bit more advanced accessory than a hat or a cowl. And it's also a little bit more fun to wear. It's a little bit more, I don't want to say fancier, but it has a little bit more oomph to it than your everyday cowl. So I really want a cowlettes to inspire beginners to start knitting kind of off the beaten path, not having to rely on cowls and hats as much, and to try something new.
And one of the cool things about cowlettes over cowls is that a cowl often looks great flat, but it doesn't work so well when you have, a neck that flares out at the bottom, as all of ours do. So cowlettes are really wearable.
Yeah. I mean, like, I love knitting cowls, but I do not like wearing cowls, if that makes sense, for that reason. Also, I just don't like the way that it lays. It never seems to lay the way I want my cowl to lay as I'm wearing it and driving. But that's what I like about cowlettes, is that they tend to stay put and they kind of drape over your shoulders. So that way you always look kind of put together when you wear one.
But also kind of like a cowl, you don't have that much of a sizing issue. So you can knit a cowlette and be reasonably sure that you don't have to worry about getting out the measuring tape.
Exactly. My favorite way to knit a cowlette is without swatching. I just knit until it's the size I want it to be, joining the round, and then I pretty much knit till I run out of yarn.
Bold. That is very bold. A knitwear designer who admits that there's something she doesn't swatch for.
Yeah, I do not always swatch for. Nope.
Well, one of the things you mentioned in the book is not only is it something that you kind of wear generally, but you can also give it as a gift. So it's not, you don't have to have a just right measurement of the recipient. You can kind of make something that you think they'll love without worrying about that.
Yeah, cowlettes are my go-to gift. I love that they're gender neutral. They are body inclusive. Anyone can wear one. So it's my go-to, and it's also a one skein wonder if you would like it to be. So you don't really need much to knit a cowlette.
Yeah. And when I think about cowlettes, my first thought is often something lacy, but there are definitely designs in your book that are gender neutral, that have a range of styles, from something that's, more lacy to something that's more geometric.
Yeah, and that's another thing I wanted to add. I wanted to add more texture, and I wanted it to be just more inclusive, and kind of, it doesn't have to just be a lace shawl-esque project. It can come in many different forms and textures. And so that was my goal.
So do you remember the first cowlette you made?
Yes. I was at an overcrowded airport terminal in Newark. If you are from Newark, New Jersey, or in that area, you know that airport's crowded and a mess. And I was knitting one by Karina Spencer. And I just loved how simple the design was. And yet it was still intriguing and engaging. So even though it was an easy knit, it wasn't boring. Like, it left you wanting to knit more cowlettes. I think I knit 3 or 4 Zuzu Petal cowlettes.
So speaking of things being accessible, one of the things that I really appreciated and found interesting in your book is, we think a lot about natural fibers and how wonderful natural fibers are, but you have a really creative and thoughtful take on using synthetic fibers, such as acrylic.
Yeah. So I just wrote a blog post on this on my Patreon, but I absolutely love using acrylic when in resin.
Yeah.
It definitely has its place. And I just knitted a cowlet in a plushy polyester acrylic blend yarn, and I love that thing. Like it's one of those yarns you use for making blankets. Like it's like plush and almost like shearing. But anyway, what I like about using acrylic is that it's an affordable gateway into cowlet knitting. It's something that you don't have to commit much money into starting to knit a cowlet. You don't have to really put anything down. But what I do really love about it too is that then you can take a more textured design instead of a more lacy one, because acrylic can be hard to block and you're still going to get a really beautiful cowlet. So if you are using acrylic or synthetic for your cowlet, then I recommend using a more textured and less lace, because it's kind of hard to open up that lace unless you kill the acrylic. And that's a whole other 15 minutes.
But one of the things you mentioned is if you're going to buy it, you use it. Don't throw it away.
Yeah, exactly. Because if we have acrylic on us, right? Like say when we first started knitting, we started buying all this acrylic yarn, and then we think we outgrow this yarn. Well, if we throw it away, or even dare I say, if we donate it, it tends to end up in the landfill. So acrylic yarn takes 200 years to break down. And then as it's breaking down, it leaches plastics into our water supply. So what I always say is if you already have acrylic yarn, just use it. And a cowlet is a great way to use that acrylic yarn. The issues with acrylic is that it tends to be too hot. It doesn't breathe. It can be heat sensitive depending on what decade the acrylic was bought.
That's true. And over 200 years is a lot of decades.
Yeah. So for example, I have an acrylic blanket that my grandmother knitted in like the 80s, and I can't put that thing in the dryer for too long. It's game over. But what I'm trying to say is that once you understand the properties of acrylic, then you can use it to your advantage to knit a cowlet. Yeah.
I just love this idea that you are working on making knitting, which can sometimes come across as being, having a little bit high barriers to entry one way or another, or being something that not everybody can pursue, and, really working on bringing everybody into that wherever they are.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in our generation, knitting is a luxury, and it really shouldn't be a luxury. But unfortunately, that's how it is these days. And so I'm trying to make it as accessible as possible. When I first started knitting, I only used yarn from big box stores. When I first started designing, a lot of my designs were from big box stores. And I did that on purpose because I really wanted it to inspire people who only had, when it was open, Joann's, Michael's. We had AC Moore, that's no longer with us. But so I just really wanted to bring everyone into the craft. So yeah, and I'm trying to bring my brand back to that as well.
Now, and tell me a little bit about your brand, because I think your website is The Drunk Knitter. So tell me a little bit about that.
So that was an accidental business name. I just thought it was funny. And then all of a sudden I started designing and sharing my life and my work, and oversharing, you can say. And it has became my name, and I just stuck with it because I still think it's funny.
Well, it definitely kind of speaks to your, authenticity. And it's not like you have said, I'm going to, choose a name based on some sort of idea for what I think my business to be. It was like, here's who I am, and in a playful way. Yeah,
like it was never meant to be a business. At the time, I was a pre-K teacher, and now it's my business. So,
you were a pre-K teacher, so you're accustomed to explaining things very carefully.
Yes, and I think that's why I like teaching knitting so much.
Yeah.
Because when you teach pre-K, it's all about having fun, And when you teach a knitting class, that's an elective class. Like you're not doing this, for college or something. Like you're willingly doing this. And so it's a great way to bring fun into this activity that can be frustrating sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I know that you have, the great thing about this book is that it sort of collects a whole range of your patterns, but you also have been, building up your business on individual patterns. So getting to see what people like and getting to talk to people who are, working from your patterns.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about, meeting the folks who are knitting your patterns.
Oh my gosh, it's always so fun. I'm always so surprised when I go to events and then I recognize a design. I'm like, is that mine? It always takes me longer than I like to admit to realize that is mine. It just brings me so much joy to know that someone is enjoying this project, because when I design, I don't just design. It's not just for me about how it looks. I really think about the knitting experience. I really want knitters to, because again, knitting has become a luxury. I really want this downtime to be relaxing and fulfilling. Sure. And so I write my patterns to reflect that as well. So it brings me joy that hopefully that pattern also brought them joy. So
yeah. Well, I have to say that I really love the joyfulness of your book. I have been just delighted to talk to you about your new book, and I loved your first book and can't wait to start making projects out of the new one. So thanks so much.
Hey, thank you so much for having me today. I always love talking about cowlettes. It is my latest obsession.
These are a couple of my favorite passages from Knitting Cowlettes. Why cowlettes? When I first started seriously knitting, meaning when a day didn't go by without picking up my needles, I became obsessed with making gifts. I loved creating something that would be cherished by the recipient. That said, I'm also a procrastinator, so I would often wait until the very last minute to get started. A day or two before a birthday, I would make the 45-minute drive to my local yarn shop to buy yarn. In Midwest terms, this is a quick drive. Head straight home and immediately cast on. Once my yarn and needles were ready to go, I would turn to my favorite gift-giving project, a cowlette. I like to give cowlettes because they are quick, gender-neutral, size-inclusive, and very useful. There are just so many scenarios that call for one, and I even gift them to myself. Wake up to a chill in the air? Pop on a cowlette. Want to dress up an outfit? Pop on a cowlette. Need to show off a knitted item at the knitting convention, and it's a very hot and crowded July day? Say it with me now. Pop on a cowlette. You might be wondering, what exactly is a cowlette? Cowlette is a term created by innovative knitwear designer Karina Spencer, and it is the love child of a cowl, a circular scarf, and a shawlette, or a small shawl. Cowlettes have a similar construction to a shawl, but with the wearability of a cowl. Shawls tend to slip and slide when worn, unless secured in some way with a knot or a shawl pin. But the best thing about making a cowlette is how customizable they are. With the help of this book, you can easily design your own. You can control the difficulty, size, yarn amount, and gauge with very little prep and only as much math as you wish. It's the perfect project for all knitters from beginner to expert. All you need to get started is a ball of yarn, circular knitting needles, and a sense of adventure. Thanks to Storey Publishing for sponsoring this episode. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.